Hello, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect. Good morning, participants. Welcome to the first plenary talk of the day. I'm Dr. Amudha, the Deputy Head of Medical School at Monash, Malaysia. It gives me great pleasure to invite and introduce Professor Dr. Liz Davis to you this morning. She's a passionate educator, an enthusiastic innovator, and a good friend of mine that I'm happy to add. She is always known to place the students' best interest above anything else. Dr. Liz is an education-focused academic in the Department of Pharmacology at Monash University, and currently the Director of Biomedical Education for the Monash Biomedical Discovery Institute. Liz has played a lead role in the development and renewal of the teaching of pharmacology across a number of degree programs, including medicine, biomedical medicine, and allied health. In all her curriculum designs, she ensures that it's well integrated and, importantly, it is appropriate for that particular student cohort. Liz has a particular interest in the development of resources, activities, and assessments that encourage active learning and support students in their own learning. Liz has been involved with pharmacology education special interest groups at the national and international level. She is currently the chair of both the Australasian Society of Clinical and Experimental Pharmacologists and Toxicologists Education Forum and the International Union of Basic and Clinical Pharmacology. In these roles, she has organized a number of workshops and symposia to help promote quality teaching of pharmacology, particularly in the context of core curricula and the development of prescribing competencies. I feel fortunate to be listening to her this morning. With that, I would like to invite Prof. Liz again to deliver her plenary talk. The floor is yours, Liz.
Thank you very much, Amudha, and I'm hoping I can share my screen here. Oops. One day I'll get to use Zoom properly. So thank you, as I said, Professor Amudha, for that introduction, and also for all of the committee for inviting me to present today. When I was first asked to give this talk, and I came up with the idea of talking about active learning, it was in 2019, I think, and I was thinking I was going to be talking to you about what we are doing in our face-to-face teaching spaces to encourage active learning. And I'm very aware that most of you out there have been involved in developing active learning resources and trying to develop teaching activities for your online students. So I'm hoping that what I'll talk about today will actually build on that and talk to you about some of the guiding principles that we have when we're developing active learning. So just to try and work through, it is a tradition in Australia that we acknowledge the people or the traditional owners of the lands that we're on. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations on whose lands I live and work, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing, but I thought it was really important to start off by thinking about why we might be concerned about active learning and why we put so much effort into trying to develop active learning resources. I'm going to give you some examples of some of the active learning activities that we've developed for our pharmacology teaching and talk through some of the guiding principles that have underlie how we have developed these programs. And I just want to finish off briefly talking about the importance of assessment alignment and why we should be thinking about redoing our assessments as well. So I was going to start off by being active and making you all do some poll to think about active learning, but in the interest of time, I'm actually going to just encourage you to think a little bit about what you think active learning might be and how you define that. And I did actually go looking on the web to try and find out what is the definition of active learning. And it's actually quite hard to find something. I think we all think we know what active learning is, and it's the opposite of passive learning. But there's no really clear definition of this. I went back and realized that active learning has been something that's been around for a very long time. We think of it as being quite recent, but in fact, it was back in the early 1990s when they were first starting to think about the importance of active learning. And they came up, well, Bonwell and Eisen came up with involving students in doing things and thinking about what they're doing. And then there was a fairly pivotal paper that we'll come back and talk about in a minute from Freeman in 2014, and really builds on that idea that we're actually using higher order thinking to complete activities or participate in discussion. So we're trying to move students beyond just recall, just memorizing, to actually get them to think about applying, explaining, discussing, etc. When we're talking about active learning, initially we were talking about things that happened in the classroom setting and particularly in lectures. And it was a way of us thinking about moving away from those very didactic traditional lectures where we had students sit and listen while we talked at them, and we assumed that by talking to them they would just absorb all of that information and they'd go away and they would learn. Of course, we know that that's not the case, and so we've been trying to develop those activities around that. But it's really not including the homework that we might send students away with or the laboratory settings. And in some ways, laboratories are the quintessential active learning. It's where we get students to do something, think about the data they get and actually explain that data. So I'm going to talk mostly about the lecture space and the workshop space today. It's also really important to note that when we're talking about active learning, we're not talking about really complex things all the time. It can actually be a very simple activity that you incorporate into your teaching. It might just be stopping and giving students time to think, or it might be about getting students to do the think, pair, share activity where they actually think about something and discuss it. That discussion, that collaboration is something that's really important and we'll keep coming back to. But of course, it can be much more complex when we start to think about case studies or problem solving activities that we incorporate into our teaching. And the active learning was really one of the drivers for the whole flipped classroom revolution. We heard a lot about flipped classrooms a few years ago. It sort of died out a little bit more now, but we're actually doing those sorts of activities all the time. The idea about using the time that we are face-to-face with the student to provide opportunities for them to think, for them to explain, for them to explore topics. And they can do the learning and the memorizing part of that in their own time. Now, it does take a lot of effort to develop active learning. And there's been a lot of resistance from academics to actually incorporate this, because ultimately the easiest thing for us to do is to stand and talk. We quite like doing that. We feel like we're masters of our topics. We stand and we talk, and of course students will take away all of that information and learn it. But we know that it's really important that we do include active learning. If we go back to that study from Freeman, it was quite a pivotal study because they looked at what the importance of including active learning activities into lecture topics was. And they compared lectures that had any form of active learning to traditional didactic lectures. And importantly, they did that in the STEM subjects. So they looked at the actual sciences and they published it in PNAS. So it actually gained credibility, not just from educators, but also from scientists out there. It was real evidence that they could take away. And what they showed with a meta-analysis of a large number of studies comparing traditional didactic lectures with active learning was that there was an improvement in student performance and a decrease in failure rates compared to the traditional lectures. And that was any form of active learning. It wasn't that there was a certain percentage of the class that was active. It wasn't a particular type of active learning. So in many ways, it may be that they've actually underestimated the impact of active learning on learning student outcomes. And they importantly made this comparison between incorporating active learning. If it was a medical treatment and we were doing a clinical trial, we'd actually stop the trial and we would say everyone should be taking active learning. And there has been some discussion about the fact that it might be actually unethical for us not to be using active learning and to be still continuing with didactic teaching because we know it improves student learning, so we shouldn't be doing anything else. Oops. No. Got that. One of the other reasons why I'm quite keen and passionate about active learning is that it can actually help to engage students. And there's probably a correlation between engagement of students and their learning as well, but it actually gets them involved in the learning. It moves them beyond just sitting and it actually makes them think a bit more and apply that. And I find that really important because, you know, we were facing a situation where our students look like this in a lecture. I'm glad to say this actually isn't a real lecture. This is not me lecturing, but this is a real lecture theatre, and I'm actually quite embarrassed to look at that lecture theatre now. I'm hoping it's not still available and still in use. But what we were trying to do is to get our students into this, where they're looking engaged, where they're looking interested in what we're doing, that they actually might be taking on board some of the things that we're trying to teach them. And of course, we know now that many of the universities are moving away from lecture theatres altogether. So not a bad thing that they're actually going to demolish that sort of lecture theatre. So just to provide some context about the teaching that I'm talking about today. As Amudha has said, I'm in the Department of Pharmacology, which is part of the Faculty of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences here at Monash, Australia. We teach into a number of the health professional courses, including medicine, but also into things like physiotherapy and radiography. But a lot of our teaching is actually into our science-based courses, particularly our Bachelor of Science, but also into the Bachelor of Biomedical Science. The ones I'm going to be particularly concentrating on today are the teaching into the medical course and also into our science-based courses. So trying to think about our teaching activities, and it seems a very long time ago, but back in pre-2020, in 2019, we were doing all of our teaching face-to-face. So we didn't know how to use Zoom. We certainly weren't very au fait with many of the technologies that we now take as second nature. Our lectures were face-to-face. Students could come to them or not, and mostly not. We had interactive workshops, and in the medical course, they call these active learning sessions, but also within the science courses, we had laboratories as well. Of course, something happened last year. I think it's a whole blur to me, but all of our teaching went online. And when we went online, we did a combination of live synchronous activities via Zoom, where we actually sort of got to see a lot of blank screens, but occasionally see some faces. And we also had a lot of directed online activities. So modules that we made available to the students to do in their own time, the asynchronous ones. And this became very important because we knew students were struggling and we had different time zones to consider. This year, we've actually been really fortunate to get back on campus, at least for semester one, and we're really hoping for semester two, it will stay on campus. However, we've gone now to a hybrid teaching model where some of our activities are still online. So our lectures are all online and we deliver them either as pre-recorded activities or we still do Zoom live lectures. We've got workshops, which in the medical course are mostly live via Zoom. But in our science teaching, we've actually been able to get the students back on campus and face-to-face for both workshops and laboratories. The problem, of course, is we have a large cohort of students who are not able to get to Melbourne, and so we have to run in parallel an online teaching program, and we need to make sure that the activities we're doing face-to-face can be easily translated to the online environment. So there's a few challenges in trying to deliver that. And I also just wanted to emphasize that we're using our learning management system is Moodle, because some of the tools that I'm talking about are actually Moodle based. So let's start by thinking about those active learning sessions and the lectures that we're talking about, moving past beyond those didactic lectures and incorporating an active approach to our lectures. We did this initially, and it's something that we've been able to translate into our online lectures, is to use the model of prepare, explore and apply. We prepare the students by giving them some sort of pre-class activity to set the context for the content that we might be talking about or to provide some of that content. In the class, we spend some time exploring the topic that we might be talking about, and after the class, there's an opportunity for students to apply some of their learning and particularly to check whether they think they're at the level that we're hoping that they are at. And one of the ways we went about doing this was by trying to package the information for each lecture into a Moodle book. So it was very clear to a student when they went in to get the lecture slides that there was a pre-activity for them to do, an explore activity in the slides, and also some post activities for them to follow up with. When we were delivering the pre-class activities, there were a number of different formats we tried. We went beyond giving them anything to read because we knew that that probably wasn't going to be very engaging for them. In some cases, we prepared a video with content that we would normally have put into the class, but we wanted to take out so that we could free up time for activities. Or in other cases, we used videos that we might have sourced from other places. that becomes a bit of a problem because our students like to know that we're responsible for the content that's going to them. So wherever we did that, we also tried to either set a very clear rationale for why we're using that video, or we try to personalize it by incorporating some things that's coming from us as well. And just to give some examples of how we've done that, we've used a lot of a program called H5P. I'm not sure if many of you know of this. It's available online, and it also now integrates into our Moodle system. But what it does is allows you to embed a video, but also to include some interactive programs through this. So if you notice, this is a video that I prepared around thyroid hormone synthesis as a preparation for a discussion about drugs in the thyroid system. And at each of these points, if you go along, you can see when you get to this, there's a quiz question that comes up, and students answer that before they can go on, and they can check their response and they can get some feedback. And at the end, there's a summary that they can go through and just make sure that they've got the main points. Other ways we've developed pre-class activities is I was a great fan, and still am a great fan of Google Forms, and these are actually really easy to embed and really easy to use. So I've developed a number of these, and one was around pharmacokinetics. So pharmacokinetics is a topic I teach to multiple cohorts, to the medical students, to the science students, to the biomedical science students, and to some of the other allied health. So it's something that we needed a pre-class activity that we could incorporate or easily adapt for each of those different cohorts. And the Google form is a really easy way of doing that. So in this, I've drawn on the Pharmacology Education Project, which I'll come back to in a minute, and directed them to that to do maybe some reading, but again, incorporated some questions for them to make sure that they're checking their understanding and to go on. I also incorporate some of my own videos into that. And if we go through all of pharmacokinetics, I can also incorporate other YouTube videos, but again, personalizing it by including our own MCQs and feedback that goes with that. Some real advantages of using particularly the Google Forms, but any sort of pre-class activity, is that you can develop this, in the case of the Google Forms, it's really easy to adapt it to the different cohorts. So maybe you don't need the same depth of information to some of the allied health as you might give in pharmacokinetics to the medical students, and easily to adapt that. It's also really easy to adapt and track student responses. So before going into the lecture, you can see what the students have answered. You can see the questions that they've got right or wrong, and you can identify which areas you might need to spend a bit more time on or go over as part of that. And that's really important. And this also just gives some examples. It's very easy to give feedback in Google Forms. Now, I said I'd come back to the Pharmacology Education Project. So this is a very unashamed plug for the Pharmacology Education Project, which is run under the auspices of IUFAR, the International Society. And it's also a peer-reviewed site, so that the information that's on here has actually gone through a vetting process. So it does include information, but it also includes some great links to resources which others have found to be really useful as part of their teaching. So this is a website which is aimed not just at the educators, but also at students. So you can direct your students to that, but also a great way to get some ideas about links that you might use or incorporate into your own teaching. And there's a SlideShare repository that goes alongside that, and some really great videos from our clinical partners in the UK that you might find useful. So just give it a plug for you to have a look at that. And you may even want to contribute some of your projects to this as well. So I've given some ideas about pre-class activities. The next thing to do, obviously, is to get into the class and start to think about what can you do. And this is where I started to struggle when I first started to think about these. What can I get the students to do in class that's relevant to them, that's actually meaningful, and that they might actually gain something from? One of the first things we do is to actually do some testing of students' understanding to see whether they've done the pre-class activities. And we can do this using a variety of methods. I use Poll Everywhere in some cases. We sometimes use Kahoots at the start, and Kahoot's a great engaging quiz program that students can get very excited about. We use a number of different polling platforms, but also in our workshops particularly, we use the scratchy cards or the immediate feedback assessment technique, the IFATs. And it's a really great way of getting some collaboration happening. And I'm happy to talk about those later if people want to know. I just thought it would be a great way to talk through a particular example I've got around how we bring the in-class and the post-class activities together. It was a topic I found particularly difficult to teach to students and the science students around PA2s and the shield analysis and what the value of a PA2 was. And it's a topic that's really hard to talk about what a PA2 is, how you do it, and what you can use it for in one single lecture and one sitting. You need students to sort of have time to digest the information. So I developed a pre-class activity using that H5P, but in this case, just using slides as behind this. And basically this activity talked students through the PA2 as a measure of antagonist potency. We talked through how to develop a PA2, the process of a shield analysis and a shield plot, and then got them to think about what the x-intercept was. And the students came into class. We had time allocated in the class for them to actually think about what that PA2 might mean. Now, this is really important. I didn't tell them first. I actually got them to think, you know how you got it, you know what it is. So think about what that might mean and predict that as a way of trying for them to draw on other knowledge they might have to make those predictions. So in this case, it's really just, what does it tell you about potency of an antagonist, which is most potent? We talked about how we might use that if we've never had used a particular antagonist before. What can the PA2 tell us about what concentration we should use? And we also talked about how it might affect selectivity as well, or how you could use it to predict selectivity. And as a post-class activity, we built on that a little bit more. We talked about a PA2 as a potential, and we also talked about exploring that a little bit more. And I should point out, we don't do a totally flipped model. We do incorporate content into our lectures, but we just make sure there's also time for students to do some thinking. And as with everything, we had a quiz at the end. When we went into post-COVID, we had obviously no opportunity to give these lectures the same way we had. We went online for the lectures. Often we had recorded lectures, and in the medical course, we had to provide recorded lectures. We could do this by just cutting up a 50-minute lecture into 15-minute digestible concepts. But again, if we just provide the lecture to them or the video to them, we're not really encouraging them to think about the topic too much. So we've also tried to package that into interactive modules. So that might be in the case of a thyroid lecture, and here again, I used H5P, sorry, and that was building on the one that I'd done previously around thyroid hormones. Again, at each of these points here, there's a quiz question that might be about, what do you know about this, and apply that into this new setting, or it might be predicting something that's going to come forward. Given that these students have also done some physiology and some hormone endocrinology. Another way we've done that is by trying to incorporate into a Moodle lesson. So in this case, we've got a 2-hour lecture that was cut around autonomic pharmacology, cut up into 4 different lectures. And what we did in each of these was actually provide the video, but also provide some opportunities for students to stop and think and to go back and test themselves as well. What also is very important in this is at the end, we had a quiz. Again, it could be via Google Forms, or we chose Kahoot challenges to build on the competitive nature of my biomedical science students. But we also learned that it's very important to provide some opportunities for reflection and feedback in that. So that the students would have to think about the learning outcomes. Did they think they met those? Were there topics that they struggled with that we need to follow up in Q&A sessions, and some feedback on the activity itself? So again, building all of that into the active component of that. Within the active learning and the workshops, again, we build things around Moodle lessons, but in the workshop activity, we want some opportunities for there to be collaboration happening. So this was one around pharmacokinetics. The students had some lectures on pharmacokinetics, and we wanted them to explore those a little bit more. So we encouraged them to draw diagrams of what of particular concepts, and particularly to post those diagrams so that they could start to share their thoughts with others, and they should be commenting also on other people's diagrams. So we saw some amazing things happen here. These are some beautifully drawn, hand-drawn ones, but we had some that were done in programs such as BioRender. We also did have some that just copied and pasted, which weren't so great. We went. And one of the things that we've been trying to play a bit with this year is to try and get some gamification happening, particularly where we had our students on campus. We're trying to develop some collaborative skills because they hadn't seen each other for a while and we needed them to start to work together. But we also were conscious that we had to have our online students also being engaged. And one of my colleagues, Claudia Budson, actually came up with a program that she'd developed a Moodle lesson last year, and we turned that into an escape room scenario. So in each of these rooms, students had a number of activities to work through, but they had a quiz question that they had to answer to unlock the key to get into the next room and continue in the program. And I just really want to finish with the last one, was around an online learning platform that we had access to, LT, which is from 80 Instruments. You may have used Power Labs or the Chart program. The LT is a cloud-based learning platform that allows for collaborative learning. And we were able to use the same program then for our face-to-face teaching and for our online teaching. And develop activities that allowed students to work together to come up with diagrams and to answer questions. And this was one from our face-to-face students who took a photo and uploaded their pictures, but we also had our online students just drawing online. And my last word is really around the idea of aligning our activities with assessment. If we think that it's really important that students become actively involved in our assessment, what we really need to do is make sure that their learning is aligning with the assessment that we're having. We know that assessment drives learning. We know that we should be assessing what we value. So if we value application over recall, then that's what we should be assessing as we go through. And just to give some examples of that, going back to my idea around PA2s, I could ask questions. That was, what is a PA2? What is a shield plot? Students could recall that. They could look on the web these days when we've got online exams, and they could answer that pretty easily. But if I turn that back on into a scenario and give them some data and say, so what can you deduce from this? What does this tell you about that antagonist? We're actually starting to extend that a little bit more and really assess their understanding to a greater level. So I apologise that I've raced all through that. I just really want to conclude by saying that it's really important that we do include active learning into our teaching programs. This is what we do to encourage students to get to that deeper level of learning that is really essential for them to understand pharmacology. We can include these in our live synchronous classes, but it's also important that we make sure that it's being included into our directed learning modules where students actually have an opportunity. And if we can turn that into a collaborative activity, that's even better. But whatever we do, we need to make sure that our teaching activities do align with our assessment. I just want to acknowledge all of the students of pharmacology in our science, biomedical science and medical degree program. They've effectively been our guinea pigs as we've trialled many of these activities. But also I want to acknowledge my pharmacology department colleagues who have been really keen to take up and try new initiatives that we've introduced, and particularly Claudia, who developed the escape rooms for this year. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions. Oops.
Thank you, Liz, for that wonderful, wonderful talk. I can see that creative juices are flowing from the crowd who've been listening to you. And I see a number of interesting questions. In the interest of time, I think I will just select one of it, and you will try and answer the rest of it a bit later. First question, what is your take on the feasibility and practicality of virtual reality in health professional education?
Oh, look, I think it's got great prospects. It's just the idea of whether we can incorporate into big classes. I mean, I think it is something that we should be looking at more, and I feel like I'm a little out of my depth when I start talking about virtual reality. The idea of being able to walk into a cell or be able to walk in and be part of a receptor drug interaction is quite exciting. I don't know who does the development of that, and I guess that's where we really need to see what's being developed to see how we might be able to incorporate that more.
Thanks, Liz. One last question. Can you tell us how to assess practical or clinical skills online?
Yeah, that's a really challenging one. And I can't talk about the clinical skills. I guess we've sort of taken the approach in our course that our practical skills are more around being able to use data to be able to present, to be able to discuss data, than to be able to do an organ bath experiment, for example. So while that is really important, I think many of our students are not going to be science-based for the rest of their life. And really what we need them to be able to do is to be critical thinkers. So we put a lot more of our effort in our science and biomedical science into actually developing those skills rather than necessarily the practical laboratory skills.
Thanks, Liz. I think that's all the time we have, folks, for today. Keep your questions coming. We will send it to Prof. Liz and get back to you. Over to you, Farouk, and let's thank Prof. Liz for this fantastic talk this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Amudha and Prof. Liz. I think we'll end this session, and thank you once again. We'll wait till we start our new session at 9:35. Thank you again.